go over this last quote here, or this other thing. I've been reading this book, um, The Monster Show by David J. Schall. David J. Schall is a film historian. He's written a great book on Dracula and the history of the making of the movie of Dracula. He's written a bunch of stuff. He's frequently a commentator on the special features for a lot of these classic monster movie DVDs. And he's even hosted some documentaries. If you looked up his name, you'd probably recognize his face if you watch a lot of that kind of stuff like I do. But this movie's a great, this book is great. It's called The Monster Show, A Cultural History of Horror. And it's really going through and doing exactly what I'm interested in. It's just talking about the cultural impact and how it's evolved and changed with the different monster stories that we have. And it opens up, I've got my place marked here. It opens up talking about the old freak shows, the carnival sideshows and whatnot. And I didn't know this, but Todd Browning, of course, we talk about him a lot in the context of being the director of Dracula. Before that, he was the iconic director of all the Lon Chaney senior films, Hunchback and the Phantom of the Opera and whatnot. But he himself was a sideshow performer. I didn't know that. And he did all kind of sideshow performances. He was even one of the ones who would get buried alive for a day or two. And he'd just have his like little slot for ventilation in the coffin and then have his snacks, his milk duds in there or whatever, and he would just hang out there until he emerges the next day or the next day or two or whatever. It's crazy. But we're talking about like the freak culture that was in our country before film came about and became where we put the freaks on the screen, quite literally in Todd Browning's case with his movie Freaks. And I'm using that word freak kind of historically, not as a derogatory term, but he makes a really interesting point here when he's talking about that kind of thing, the carnivals and the freak shows and whatnot. And I'm just going to read this paragraph because I think there's so much here and we'll kind of unpack it and talk about it as we go. But he says, popular amusements have a flip side that is often less than sunny. And the very word recreation has some usually overlooked connotations. Any process of recreation, right? That's where the word recreation comes from. It's a recreation. Any process of recreation or recreation, rebirth, necessarily entails a death of one sort or another, right? You can't be recreated if you haven't died first, right? And metaphorically, we're trying to think about this in terms of what we would call recreation, in terms of just relaxing, just going, because that word recreation has the connotation of rejuvenation, right? If you go on a nice vacation and it was good recreation and you just come back, the idea is you're rejuvenated, you're recreated, ready to go forth. But think about what the word means. It means there's necessarily some sort of death that happens first. He says this may explain the prevalence of sugar-coated intimations of mortality in carnivals and fun parks, spook shows, wild rides involving heart-stopping plunges and near collisions, and the omnipresent, endlessly cycling wheels and whirligigs of chance, fate, and destiny. Freak shows similarly offer a glimpse of ourselves, recreated along strange physical or behavioral lines. Nothing is fixed and everything is possible. And we can say freak shows, but we can also just say movies, our monster movies in particular, movies about the strange and the freakish or whatever. And it's showing humanity, something we recognize, against something warped, askew, different. There's an uncanniness there. And it's amplified all the more. I mean, it was done up in the drama of freak shows as well. I mean, you might have a real human being with a condition that makes them this or that, a pinhead, say, what they used to be called in carnival times or whatever, or something like that. That's a human being with a medical condition, but the way it's presented in the carnival sideshow was, this, freak of nature, this otherworldly kind of being or whatever, and that's what we see in film as well. We see, with the tricks of modern day filmmaking, we see something that looks human, but is actually a wolf, a werewolf or something. And I think it's interesting that there's always that element of mortality in our recreation. And you think about it, we all understand that as fans of movies and video games and things like that. Even really giving yourself over to music, there's a moment of you just kind of lose yourself in it. That's the fun of these things. When you get into a hobby, you get into a franchise or whatever, you just so completely lose yourself in it, and that's the fun of it. You get to the point where the world of this video game or this series of books or these movies or whatever, and it's fun for you. It's a lot more fun than living in the real world for a while. Now you can take that to an unhealthy point, obviously, and neglect real world responsibilities or actual reality. But in a perfect world. It's supposed to be a place where it's recreation. You're sort of recreated in that world because you're rejuvenated. Your brain's had some time to rest. There was a German philosopher by the name of Schiller who talks about a principle he called Spieltrieb, and there's a lot to that. I'm just brushing the surface of it here because it kind of relates to what I'm saying, but you could get, somebody to really, or you could do a deep dive on that and find out really what he's talking about. But the idea of Spieltrieb was that we are at our most human when we are at play, because we are at 100% what we would want to do. Everything that we do when we play is what we are fighting for to do when we're trying to survive. So as we're trying to perpetrate our DNA, or trying to eat, and trying to make sure that we've got work, so we've got our expenses covered. These are things we kind of have to do, or we're biologically impaired to do. But what does our soul want to do? You see that when we are at play, or we are at recreation, or something like that. And I think that plays into this a little bit. And I mean, this is what people who are drug addicts or sex addicts or are thrill junkies, like extreme sports thrill junkies, really people who are super into CrossFit, or whatever. They're chasing this ecstasy. And what I mean by ecstasy is the word means, it comes from the Latin ex stasis, which means being outside of oneself. That's what the fun of these kinds of things are. That's why people, when they go out dancing and they're really into clubbing or whatever, and because when they're out with a bunch of other people and that beat's taking over their body or whatever, they kind of leave their bodies, so to speak, metaphorically. And that's what drugs do for you, right? That's what any kind of good recreation does for you. And you can take it to a very unhealthy point, obviously. but recreation in general, it's just a little bit of that, just to help you kind of, recreate yourself. Like, I talk about, my daughter loves roller coasters. I love taking her to amusement parks, and yeah, the more thrilling, the better. She loves it. She can't, now some of it is because of her, it's a vestibular stimulation with her brain, the way her autism works too, with spinning around and around is kind of a help for her sensory processing disorder, and how she handles things like that. But in general, yeah, the more of the thrill, the more of the let's shake things up a little bit. Let's go over this loop, or let's go down this hill, and let's in terms of roller coasters, and really feel like, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have survived that. It's a little bit of a recreation, and I think that's what monster movies, more than any other type of film, I would argue, and you can certainly see this in all kinds of other type of film, anything that's a good escapism. But I think monster movies really, and horror movies in general, really do embody that, because that's the fear. It's the threat of death. It's the threat of not only death, but depending on the movie, a violent death, or even if not death, a horrid, painful moment or whatever, which really does put into sharp focus your existence, and life and death, and what's important and what's not important. And these are all the things that can get a little out of focus as we go through our daily lives and our daily responsibilities. That's what good recreation is for. That's what good monster movies are for. It's the other aspect of that I wanted to talk about. So I don't know. I love that. I love that quote. I thought it was really interesting. I just wanted to talk about it a little bit. Honestly, I'm still kind of mulling it over. Like, I think I could really think through it even more so, and even like write up a paper or do a whole YouTube video on it or something. But it's just something that struck me as really interesting. I wanted to share here a little bit as we chatted and talked on the stream.